All right, everybody, let's get today's program started. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Good to be with you for another edition of our program. The Lunchtime Discovery Series is brought to you by the Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality, and it's a broadcast service of us here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. My name is Chris Smith, and I, as usual, am your host for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. It's always exciting to gather around the glow of our YouTube screens for this series. We meet really interesting people doing really cool and interesting stuff out there in the worlds of science and nature, conservation, education, and beyond. And it's really exciting because we can all find out what are the stories that are happening in North Carolina, what's interesting stuff that people are doing in our state, sometimes and beyond as well. But a lot of times our guests don't have to travel very far. I mean, we're all hanging out on Zoom. They're not traveling at all necessarily. But I'm excited for today's presentation because, well, even in physical space, we're pretty close to the museum with today's guest and for today's presentation. Now, before I introduce him, I want to remind everybody that the Lunchtime Discovery Series is an interactive program. That means that I want to hear and see your thoughts, comments, and questions. All you got to do is log into your YouTube account, and then you can be in the chat posting your thoughts and questions as we go through the program. For today's lecture, I'll actually be keeping an eye on the chat throughout the whole thing. And as questions come up, we're going to drop them right into the program and hopefully get a good conversation going about today's topic and with today's guest speaker. And then, of course, we'll have a little bit of time set aside at the end in order to take your questions as well after you had a moment to download the entirety of the presentation and formulate your thoughts. But don't miss out on the opportunity to get your questions answered. Now, let me bring on today's guest. Everybody, I want you to meet Bryan England. Bryan is the preserve manager at Louise Wilkerson, MD, Nature Preserve Park with the City of Raleigh Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources Department. And Bryan joins me now. Hi, Bryan.
Hi, Chris.
Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here today.
I'm excited for your talk only because the folks who organized this, Lisa and Marty, have been chatting with us quite a bit about this heirloom or ancient legumes project that's going on at Wilkerson Nature Preserve. So I'm curious what you've got going on.
Sure. That we're be happy to talk about that today. We're trying to bring back a little bit of the history of the land in the Piedmont here, and that'll be the subject of my talk.
Very
So,
exciting.
and should I switch over to slides now?
Yeah, let's go ahead and bring up your presentation, and then I'll turn the program over to you.
Okay, then I've got it pulled up. I'm sharing. Okay, are we
Looks good.
good? All right. Well, welcome everybody. I hope you can see me. My name is Bryan England. I'm here, the manager at Wilkerson Nature Preserve Park. We're a City of Raleigh park, I should point out. And if you're wondering where any of this is, then let's see, how do I move up? There we go. We're a 157-acre property. We're located just north of the city of Raleigh, close to Falls Lake. The park was a donation to the city of Raleigh by Dr. Louise Wilkerson. So I know many people in the Raleigh community remember her. She was a physician here in Raleigh, delivered about 7,000 babies in the course of her career. I've met many of those babies coming to visit the park as adults. So many people remember Dr. Annie Wilkerson, and she's the reason this preserve exists. When she donated it to the city, she specified that it was to be a nature preserve park and that it be used for what she called the primary purposes of nature and wildlife education and research into the methods of conservation. So that's what we do here. Lots of nature education, which is why I'm so happy to be here today. I'm speaking with the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences and this EE Discovery program for Earth Day. So this is a kind of special month, I know. This is the Earth Day month. So I've got a question for all of you. And I'm gonna try and make this interactive. So I can't see the chat. You're gonna have to tell me. So this is a question. I want to see if anybody can guess this Earth Day related book quote. All right. So here's your quote. It all started way back, such a long, long time back. This is a book a lot of people read around Earth Day. And let's see if we get any guesses here. That's the quote from the book. I'll give you a clue. The book was published in 1971, right? 1 year after the first Earth Day. So just 1 year after the first Earth Day, 1970, this book was published. Millions of copies sold. The book was written entirely in rhyme. Right? This is a book written entirely in rhyme. Any guesses? Any guesses?
There is a delay between our Zoom
Okay.
and the
Oh,
live stream
and the
audience,
live stream.
but it looks like they're getting the first of the clues right now. I think I know what it is.
Then I'll give you one more clue. I'll give you one more clue. The title of the book rhymes with borax. Title of the book rhymes with borax. Does anybody know the name of the book that this quote comes from?
Oh yeah, the chat's going off. They all got it.
Okay, all right. So do we have some correct answers out there in the chat?
Yeah, Chris and Hannah, not me, said it's the Lorax.
It is the Lorax. That's exactly right. So a really popular book dating back to the earliest days of Earth Day. And you might wonder, why am I bringing up the Lorax here? Well, it's kind of related to the theme of this whole talk. Because the Lorax, in its colorful, fictional way, is really a story, which I'm sure many of you have heard, about history and the importance of understanding history. The whole plot of the Lorax is about a small child who goes to hear a lecture about local history from the Onceler, and then he sits through this long lecture about local history, and then at the end of the book, the child is empowered to make environmental decisions for his community. And that's the plot of the Lorax. Learning history can change your life. Now, it's a cartoonish way, but in some ways, it reflects history that we've actually experienced. So even though I'm here to talk about peas, I'm going to talk about some history first. Here in the Piedmont of North Carolina, where we are, way back in the days, as the Lorax put it, there has been enormous change over the centuries, especially in the period that I'm going to talk about, which we refer to as the 1700s. In the early days of the 1600s, colonization didn't move very fast in North Carolina. You can see there's a picture here. And even by 1715, colonization really only touched the fringes of the coast. Total population in 1730, according to our history museum in Raleigh, was around 35,000 people for the whole state. But then, just 20 years later, 1750, 100,000 people. 1765, 200,000 people. 1776, 300,000 people. By 1790, 400,000 people, and North Carolina has become the third most populous state in the brand new USA. 1790 was when North Carolina had the largest share of the US population that it will ever have in its entire history, before or since. And you can see on the map how that growth was really rapid in the Piedmont during those years, because this is when the Piedmont filled in. After the 1790s, growth slows down dramatically. North Carolina drops to 4th place, and by 1860, North Carolina was 12th in the country by population. City of Raleigh's population actually shrank between 1820 and 1830. We got smaller. Between 1830 and 1840, almost half of North Carolina's counties lost population. And by 1850, 400,000 people born in North Carolina lived in other states. By 1860, North Carolina had the lowest percentage of people born in other states living within North Carolina of any state in the country. We've shifted from being a state that everybody moved to a state that was known at the time as a state that people moved from. Why did this happen? Why did so many people rush in, especially to the Piedmont, and then that stops and there's a big rush out? Well, when we look back at the writings people left at the time, Here's a way one put it. This was written by Albion Tourgi. He lived in Guilford County and wrote this in 1880, describing North Carolina. He said, referring to a character in his book, came from up north somewhere about 1790, back when everybody thought this Peavine country was a sort of new Garden of Eden. And that expression, this Peavine country, is referring to where we are right now, here, central North Carolina. Now, if you looked around North Carolina now, the number one plant to describe central North Carolina, we might call us pine tree country, maybe. But when was the last time you heard North Carolina referred to as Peavine country? But if you go back in time, North Carolina was famous, central North Carolina, the Piedmont, for its pea vines. And people thought it was amazing. They thought it was beautiful. They traveled hundreds of miles to move into this new Peavine country territory because they liked it so much. And then, well, it's kind of like the story in the Lorax. The Peavine country didn't last. When the pea vines were gone, well, things turned around. So since this is all ancient history, what was Peavine country and what was Peavine? I'm just going to say, I am not talking about these peas. These are not the peas I'm talking about. So if you think you're looking for recipes, green peas, black-eyed peas, those are not the peas that we're talking about in the 1700s. I promised you that can was going to appear at some point. So if you're wondering, well, what did these pea vines, these wild pea vines look like? This is an early illustration of wild pea vine as it was perceived way back in the 1700s. This is a lovely painting. And the text that came along from this painting, you can see here. The text said, "The caterpillar of this rare species," referring to the butterfly. Okay. "The caterpillar of this rare species I discovered by seeing the butterfly lay some eggs upon the wild pea vine." And this picture shows a plant. You can see it's a vining plant, and it's got big, beautiful flowers. And at the time, in the 1700s, everybody wasn't a botanist. So these plants were called wild pea vine almost regardless of what specific species they were. This particular writer tried to identify this plant with a Latin name. He called it Clitoria mariana, but he's wrong about that. If you look closely at it, it's not a clitoria, it's a Centrosema virginiana, but they were all wild pea vine to the people at the time. If it was a wild pea, it got called a wild pea vine. Wild pea vine was not a single species, it was many species, but they were beautiful and they were abundant and they attracted a lot of people to our region. So because the pea vine landscape doesn't exist today the way it used to, I can't show you a photograph of North Carolina from the 1700s. No photographs from the 1700s exist. I really can't even find a good painting of the landscape prior to settlement. So I'm going to use a word picture here that I hope will paint a picture in your mind or your imagination for what North Carolina, central or western North Carolina, might have been like back in those days. So this poem, I did not write it myself. It was written by a native North Carolinian, though, Robert Morgan, a professor at Cornell University, taught there for 40 years, inducted in the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame. You may have heard this poem read on National Public Radio. If you're a big NPR listener, you may have heard it read there. But I hope it'll paint a little bit of a word picture of what North Carolina might have looked like back in those days. So here we go. Wild Pea Vines by Robert Morgan. I have never understood how the mountains, when first seen by hunters and traders and settlers, were covered with pea vines. How could every cove and clearing, old field, every opening in the woods, and even understories of deep woods be laced with vines and blossoms in June? They say the flowers were so thick the fumes were smothering. They tell of shining fogs of bees above the sprawling mess, and every bush and sapling tangled with tender curls and tresses. I don't see how it was possible for wild peas to take the woods in shade in deep hollows and spread over cliffs and hanging gardens and choke out other flowers. It's hard to believe the creek banks and high ledges were that bright. But hardest of all is to see how such profusion, such overwhelming lushness and lavish could vanish, so completely disappear that you must look through several valleys to find a sprig or strand of wild peavine curling on a weed stalk, like some word from a lost language once flourishing on every tongue. So that is Wild Peavines by Robert Morgan. Appreciate his support for this. And I love that metaphor at the end, like some word from a lost language once flourishing on every tongue. We don't talk as much about pea vines anymore like they did. However, it's not completely lost. If you look in the dictionary, you will still find an entry for pea vine. Merriam-Webster will still have it. There it is, pea vine, noun, any of various usually twining American herbaceous leguminous plants. I'm not sure that definition is terribly helpful to the average person, but it is still in the dictionary. It's not a completely lost word. So peavine was a general term, as I've said before, just like we might say pine tree for all pines. Now, back in the 1800s, peavine, everybody talked about peavines. George Washington talked about wild peavines. Thomas Jefferson talked about wild peavines. Theodore Roosevelt mentions wild peavines in one of his books that he wrote. Little school children in the Carolinas for decades were taught about peavines in their textbooks in the schools in the Carolinas. And I'm sure children in the 1800s are not that different from children today. And when the teacher was going on about the peavines, they wanted to know, is this going to be on the test? So I have here on the screen, this is directly from one of those textbooks. This is the test question. So yes, peavines were on the test. The children would be expected to answer, what is said of the peavine? And I suppose they'd have to rise and give a response or write an essay. That was an actual question on the test. That was from a textbook first published in 1869, and then it was reissued in 1894. So literally generations of school children in the Carolinas had to answer our test question about the peavine. Now, I have 3 kids today. They tell me that peavine has not been on any of their tests yet, but maybe next year. So what is said of the peavine? If you were a child in the 1800s and you got assigned the question that we just read, you would probably turn to your history books that you had available at that time, and you would try and find what the answer was. And so one of those outstanding works of North Carolina history that would have been available, Foote's Sketches of North Carolina, Historical and Biographical from 1846, might have been one of the books that one of those children would have turned to. And here's what it says about the peavine. Immigration was encouraged and directed very much in its earliest periods by the vast prairies with peavine grass and canebrakes which stretched across the states of Virginia and Carolina. There are large forests now, this is in 1846, in these 2 states where 100 years ago, not a tree and scarce a shrub could be seen. So that was the answer to the test question. There were vast prairies with peavine grass all over Virginia and Carolina. Carolina generally, North Carolina, South Carolina, especially in the Piedmont. But even in 1846, this is already history. This is already history by that point. The vast prairies are not there. Instead of these vast prairies with peavine grass, by the time he's writing this, there are large forests on top of where the peavine used to grow. And the prairies have largely vanished. But back in the 1700s, as he says, the prairies abounded with game and supplied abundant pasturage, both winter and summer, for the various kinds of stock that accompanied the immigrants. And that's the key factor here. So what Foote says, immigration was encouraged and directed by these prairies with peavine grass. He's not kidding about that. The people moving into North Carolina were being encouraged, and the locations of the settlement were being steered by these prairies and peavine concentrations. The peavine was a superfood for their herds, and so they would preferentially go to where they could get it. The canebrakes would feed the cows in the winter, and the peavine would feed the cows in the summer and fall. And so if you had peavine and canebrake in proximity, you could feed your cows 12 months out of the year without doing any work, without cutting any hay, without stacking. It was like paradise, or so people felt. And so it directed a lot of the motion into the colony. But was this good for the Peavine? Well, if you're wondering what this might have looked like on a map, here's a map from 1719, and here's Carolina, and you can see the mountains, and in front of the mountains, but west of the coast, there's a big region in what we call the Piedmont that's just labeled Grand Savanna. Well, that's savanna is just another sort of word for a prairie with scattered trees. So we're talking about a huge area where this prairie / peavine type ecosystem might have once extended. So what is said of the peavine? We have Foote's words, but let's check somebody else. So this is Logan. He puts it like this. As late as 1775, the woodlands carpeted with grass and the wild peavine growing as high as a horse's back and wildflowers of every hue were the constant admiration of the traveler and adventurous pioneer. The trees were large and stood wide apart. There was nothing to obstruct the view but the rolling surface. The peavine and grasses occupied the place of the bushes and young forest growth that rendered the woods of the present time so gloomy and intricate. Okay, so this is 1859. And the former Peavine land has turned into gloomy and intricate young forest. So Peavine's already disappearing fast. The wild pea grew chiefly on the highlands, and the cane flourished best in the valleys and filled the lower grounds of all the streams. Both the peavine and the maiden cane are still found in the upcountry, but only in situations where they are shut in from hogs and cattle. Now, this is an interesting point here. So you really see by this point, the peavine is mostly a matter of history, but it can still be found, but only in situations where they are shut in. So in the early days of the Carolinas, we were an open range state, like we think of the Wild West, where if you had cows, you didn't put them in a fenced pasture. Instead, you put a fence around your garden and turned your cows loose into the woods. And the cows ate whatever they could find out there. And, well, the result, by this point, is that the peavine, as he says, is still found, but only in situations where they are shut in, where somebody put a fence around a little bit of land, and the peavine is hiding inside the fence from the free-ranging cows and pigs that are eating it up everywhere else. These are the last places where they saw it, where it was shut in from hogs and cattle. Now, if we skip forward just a few more years, this is from 1869. In many places, the wild peavine grew as high as a horse's back, and the blossoms were very plentiful. The pea was a stalk rather than a vine. It has utterly disappeared from the country, and so has the rich and abundant high grass that used to carpet these wild woods. Well, that's pretty bleak. So a wonderful peavine, it was like the Garden of Eden. It directed the location of the settlers, and their herds ate it up. Peavine becomes scarce, it hangs on where there's fences protecting it, and then people seem to say it's gone. And we can see clues as to how this happened through these accounts. Now, you might be wondering, when it says utterly disappeared, does utterly disappeared, should we take that literally? Does that mean that the peavine went extinct? The same way the Carolina parakeet is extinct, or the passenger pigeon is extinct? Well, you got to remember, peavine was a category. It wasn't just one species. So as a broad category, we have many species of peavine still living today, but there were wild peas in North Carolina that did indeed go extinct in the 1800s. We know that for a fact. So I have to point out that some did completely disappear. This specimen here in the picture is what is called a big leaf scurf pea, and it was collected by scientists only twice in history, 1897 and then again in 1899 from Polk County, North Carolina. And it was never seen again after that, and it's now presumed to be completely extinct. So yes, some pea species actually did disappear completely. But what's notable is it disappeared fairly late in the 1890s. most of the peavine was described historically as disappearing by the early 1800s. Now, we have no way of knowing how many other species may have declined or disappeared earlier without being scientifically collected. It's just impossible to say. But we do know that at least one species of pea in North Carolina did disappear completely. Now, the former abundance of pea vines, I just gave you 3 quotes before, but we could spend this whole hour just reading historical witness after historical witness after historical witness, gushing and gushing about the tall pea vines growing luxuriantly, and the open prairie dotted with trees, and the wild grass and pea vine, or the hills were covered with the pea vine, and how the pea vine looked like a garden, and it was all so beautiful. You can see some of these quotes here. And people were a little bit mystified by how it all disappeared and turned into forest. One fellow there at the bottom says, these changes, the prairie with pea vine into forest, covered with pine and oak, it's an interesting question in science as to the cause of this transformation. Yes, I suppose it is an interesting question. How do you take a vast prairie with peavine grass and turn it into a dense forest in less than 100 years? How does that happen? And if only we had, a really good scientist to investigate, and we actually do. Elisha Mitchell wrote what is possibly the most detailed account of the process by which the peavine and the ecosystem that it existed in disappeared. This particular passage I have not seen quoted very many other places at all. And if you don't know who Elisha Mitchell was, is a professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in the early 1800s. He is the gentleman that Mount Mitchell, tallest mountain in North Carolina, is named after. Mitchell County, also named in honor of Elisha Mitchell, a great figure in the history of science in North Carolina. And what I'm going to put up here was originally published in 1845, and it's based on his decades of experience in Western North Carolina. So first, he makes this observation. Speaking of Western North Carolina, that the families by whom these Western North Carolina counties were settled were from below the ridge, meaning below the Blue Ridge, from the Piedmont. So the families in Western North Carolina in the 1830s and 40s were from the Piedmont, and brought with them into the mountain region the kind of husbandry to which they had been accustomed in the warmer and drier parts from which they came. So he's saying that the people in the mountains were carrying on and repeating the same things that had happened in the Piedmont previously. They moved west and kept on doing what they were doing. So what were they doing? Well, here's how he describes what was happening. Whilst the Indians held possession of the country, it was burnt over every year. The fire destroyed the greater number of the young trees that were springing up, and the large ones remained thinly scattered, like the apple trees in an orchard with large open spaces between. In these, the different kinds of native vines and other wild plants, pea-vine, etc., contended for mastery. Okay, so he's comparing the condition to being like an orchard. It looked so nice. And he only mentions one plant by name, just one, pea-vines. Everything else is etc. It's pea-vines and etc., everything else. And then what happens? Well, by this time, after the Indians had been removed and large quantities of stock were introduced, the cattle and horses interfered in the contest of nature in favor of what he calls the worst kinds. Cattle and horses ate out and destroyed what they found palatable, and the plants that were worthless were permitted to grow and occupy the ground. And with the annual firing the woods that had been practiced by the Indians having ceased, the brushes and small trees overspread and shaded the large spaces that were formerly covered with herbage. So because of those two reasons, the best kinds of vegetables, meaning the pea-vine, have been in great measure eaten out and destroyed, and because of the thickening of the forest, no fire, the range is now greatly inferior to what it would have been 50 years earlier. So he's really broken it down for us. He's a scientific man, and it's that combination of two factors. No more annual burning, trees grow up thick, shade everything out, and herds and herds and herds of livestock eating anything that's edible. Pea-vine was the most edible thing of all. It got eaten up first. So what's the future? What happens from this point forward? What did they do? Well, Mitchell predicts the future for us. At this point, it is necessary here, as in other cases, the industry and ingenuity of man should come in to direct and to some extent control the operations of nature. The best grasses, best for pasturage, must be introduced. And he predicts that these lands that have become waste and worthless, Peavine's been eaten up, that they will be converted into artificial pastures, and that this progress is already underway. So he's foretelling the next era in North Carolina history, whereas the vast prairies, the peavine grass fed the first generation of farmers' herds, free ranging. The next generation will not be able to eat the peavine. The peavine is eaten up, and artificial pastures and introduced plants are going to supply the gap. And that is exactly what occurs. Now, of course, people who were used to peavines as the standard for greatness were very interested in introduced peavines. Some of you may have heard of some introduced peavines that became very popular in North Carolina in the course of the 1800s. For example, what is kudzu if not a really big Asian peavine? If peavines were the best pasture, then surely a new peavine can replace the peavines that have disappeared. So kudzu was promoted as a solution to the grazing problems. Not just kudzu. In the 1800s, cowpea, which was originally from Africa, was very popular as a plant to grow to feed the livestock. Also what they called Korean clover, and then Cereacea lespedeza bicolor, Japanese lespedeza. They were also all promoted as new plants to feed the livestock on the pastures of North Carolina and other southern states under the new conditions. Now, today, 100 years later, many of those non-native peas are viewed as noxious weeds, or they're state listed as noxious weeds and invasive species. And that's a fair point. None of these introduced peas were ever as nutritious as the original ones. The Cereacea lespedeza, even the kudzu, they never worked as well for the livestock as the promotions tended to say that they would, and then they would tend to spread out of control. But if you ever wonder why were people so eager to plant non-native peas, well, for 100 years, they grew up being taught how wonderful peavine had been. So a new peavine sounded like an obvious solution. Now I skipped, I skipped this page, but I don't want to leave it out completely. Because while the peavine was disappearing, a lot of people did notice. People took notice of that. And many people were concerned. Right up to the tops of the country. At the top here, we've got a letter to Thomas Jefferson, preserved in Thomas Jefferson's papers, where William Strickland writes to him that peavine, which is highly nutritious to cattle, he finds that it's still plentiful west of the mountains of Virginia, and this is in 1796, and was probably equally plentiful east of the mountains, but it has there long since carried its own destruction by its own good qualities, and tells Mr. Jefferson that this appears highly worthy of attention. Okay, this is 1796. Like, Mr. Jefferson was just writing the Declaration of Independence a few years earlier. The Revolutionary War is wrapped up. He's a very busy man, but Mr. Jefferson, the peavine is highly worthy of your attention. This is what Mr. Strickland is saying. It was a major problem. Lots of other people noticed it. Benjamin Smith Barton, he was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the early 1800s, author of the first textbook of botany ever written in the United States. As he describes the situation. No pains are taken to preserve this plant, nor any of the valuable native Hedysaura, which we call peavines. Indeed, in many parts of our country, these plants, as well as the buffalo clover and others, are on a fair way to being totally exterminated. Mr. Barton is concerned. This next one, you've got to read this one to believe it. This is in 1833. Appeared in the Farmer's Register, a letter about wild peavines. The writer says, I have often been told by the old people of the astonishing luxuriance of the tall wild peavine in old times on lands now the poorest. of the great quantities of food which it afforded for stock, its vines, leaves, and fruit greedily devoured by horses, cows, and sheep, so that its very value seems to have caused its utter extermination. With so much worth and so many enemies, is it not entitled to a single friend? 1833, is the Peavine not entitled to a single friend? Now that sounds like something from the environmental movement of the 1970s. Like you can imagine the Lorax saying, is the Peavine not entitled to a single friend? But that was 1833. People were alarmed at the decline of the Peavine. In South Carolina, Dr. James Davis suspected, this was in 1836, he said, "It is to be feared that many species of the native grasses best adapted to our soil have become extinct by our negligence." It's 1836, and he already thinks our best grasses have gone extinct. But his hope, his most optimistic hope, is that perhaps a solitary, vigorous, and succulent tussock may be found in some unfrequented nook. Dr. Davis died 2 years after that. He was old enough to remember the 1770s, 1780s when there still was peavine, but he lived long enough to see that sort of habitat disappear. By 1860, it was mostly gone, but people remembered it. And Atkinson wrote, if the country has been cursed, it is by the agriculture that they had introduced. So the decline of peavine did not go unnoticed. And there were interests in doing something about it. There were people way back when that thought perhaps some intervention could prevent the peavine from disappearing. George Washington, on his farm, he recorded in his diary that some of the wild peavine that had been planted on his farm had been harvested. George Washington also wrote with Strickland about the possibility that the wild pea would work in cultivation. He wasn't sure if it would or not, but he admitted it would be highly nutritious and beneficial if it could work in cultivation. But they never really found a way to make the native peas work in cultivation, despite some attempts. In Georgia, it was the same story. People said the wild peavine originally grew all over the state, and if it was domesticated, that would be very useful. Some people said the domestication would be easy. Then they actually tried it, and they said, they've attempted its cultivation, but it has constantly escaped us. It was not easy to cultivate after all. They urged other farmers to look to see if they still had any peavine on their land. The only place where you might find it, they would say, would be in spots inaccessible to cattle because it is never spared where they can reach it. Now, there was one glimmer of hope. This is the only glimmer of hope I've found in all this reading from the 1800s. In South Carolina in the 1880s, the laws changed requiring the fencing of cows. And so instead of letting your cows run freely, they had to be confined. And some people noticed, I'll quote, "Since the abolition of the fence law has restricted the range of cattle, many grasses and forest plants thought to be extinct have reappeared, among them the wild pea and vetches." So there was this brief window of time after the cows were fenced when the wild peavine that was no longer known appeared again, and they noticed it, or they thought it might be the wild peavine they remembered, along with other plants, which just goes to show how much the impact of the grazing had been, how sensitive to grazing they were. But something else was also happening. The prairies, they were becoming covered with trees. Oaks and things were covering them. So even with the cows fenced in, the open sunny prairie was also getting shaded. Fencing and fire didn't get along very well. These were all wooden fences. So when people invested time and labor in building wooden fences, they didn't like to burn as much. And without burning, even if you fenced out the cows, then the woods grew up, the woods became dark, and the sun-loving peavines, they seemed to fade away. But for a brief moment, they had hope that the peavine might be coming back. So this is the grand unified theory of peavines. I'm not going to read it, but if you boil down all of these historical accounts and a lot more that I didn't even put up here, this becomes the periods of peavine ecology in our region. This is your little, if you're wondering what makes peavines, this is a grand unified theory of peavines. If you constrain your herbivores and you burn your forests regularly, you seem to have a lot of peavines. If you're not burning your forests and you're not restraining your herbivores, there seem to be very few peavines. So if we can understand this, if we can put all this together, we can do kind of like what happens in the Lorax, and we go through all of this ancient history. Could we take all this historical knowledge and try to bring back the kind of landscape that was described? Is it possible to have land dominated where peavines are the most conspicuous plant on a large scale? Is that even possible today? So we decided to try that because I like trying things. So this is a photo taken here at Wilkerson Nature Preserve back during COVID. And that's Brett Ladry there in the middle. Hi, Brett. Brett is a biologist now with the Wildlife Resources Commission. He's gone on to bigger things than Wilkerson. But when he was a young man, he worked here for us. So that's him standing in the photo. And that is the edge of our parking lot. You're wondering where a parking lot was going to come into this story. And that piece of land right behind him is what we picked for our experiment area. So it looks, as you can see right there, dense, gloomy, and intricate young forest, right? The sort of stuff that they said covered up the land that used to be the prairies and the peavine. You can see it's full of loblollies, and there's red cedars, and there's sweet gums, and there's other stuff. There's privets and honeysuckles and Russian olives and a bunch of junky stuff. So nothing very special. And we wanted to see if there was any way we could take that and turn it into something like the old peavine country. Well, we knew what would have to happen. Can't leave it like that. First, the dense foliage has to be cut, right? Like we can't leave it gloomy and intricate. So with the help of some YCC crews and other volunteers, all that woody foliage was cut out. And only the large, well-spaced trees were retained. So here's what it looked like after that clearing. There's the YCC crew. So now it's sunny again. You can see the sunlight on the ground. Large trees, well-spaced. You can see through it. That's the way the historical description sounded. Now, it's not going to stay like that, though. You turn your back on it, and it's going to grow right back up with trees and bushes again, right? Something had to be keeping the vast prairies from turning into forest. And they turned into forest really fast. People were shocked at how quickly they turned into forest in the 1800s. Well, in the old days, what kept them as forest? Elijah Mitchell talked about this, the fire. So if we were really going to try and bring back even a tiny piece of the old peavine habitat, we're going to need to keep this open, which means we're going to need to burn it every year. So every year in the winter, we light that little piece of land on fire in March in coordination with the Forest Service, who's helped us a great deal. And the fire runs right through it in a few minutes. It doesn't take very long at all and turns everything black to ash. So just a few weeks ago, we burned it again this year. So the fourth time we burned it. And afterwards, everything is cooked to ash, just big trees and ashy ground. And we wondered, especially the first time we burned it, well, what's going to happen? And we came back in a few months. I'm not kidding about the fire. We burned it all to ash. And here it is by summer. So this is July, and this is the same area. And you can see all that charred ground emerged with a lush carpet. I don't know what else to call it. It's like a carpet of almost everything in that photo is a pea. All different kinds of wild native peas, just covering the land a few months after the fire took place. And we didn't plant any of them. We planted nothing. We added no seeds. We added no plugs. We planted absolutely nothing. We cleared away the brush. Then we burned the land. And then this is what came up a few months after the fire. And this is kind of what happened in the 1800s when they fenced out the cows. Now, you notice one other thing we did. You'll see there's a fence surrounding the area. we do not have cows here at Wilkerson Nature Preserve anymore. We did until 2005. Until 2005, there were cows, and they went everywhere and they ate everything that the cows eat. We do not have the cows today. However, instead we have deer, and the deer go everywhere and eat everything the deer eat. So we noticed that outside of this fence, the peas immediately get chewed down to nothing, down to little tiny stubs. The lush carpet stops very abruptly at the fence line, and that's entirely due to the deer. So fencing out the cows, or in our case, the deer, seems to be a very necessary ingredient to all of this, combined with the clearing and the burning, and then this is what you get. So it's been an interesting experiment. I realize this isn't very big. This is only about a 8/100th of an acre. So we're a long way from vast prairies, all right? Vast prairies covering 2 states with pea-vine grass. We are a long way from vast prairies. But maybe, just maybe, this little 8/100ths of an acre is kind of a window into what some of those people saw. That Garden of Eden, that pea-vine country that all of this at one time was described to be. So we can get some other photos here. So you can see it's not all the same. It's really a mix of many different kinds of peas. There's over a dozen different wild native pea species that popped up inside this little tiny, less than 1/10 of an acre patch. So it's really high diversity of native peas without us planting any of it. You've got the big partridge pea there on the left with little yellow flowers. You can see the big desmodiums there on the right. Down low, there's little creeping lespedizas, native lespedizas, all different sorts of peas growing together in just this abundance. Here's some of the taller, stickier ones. And remember they said how tall the pea grew back in the old days, as high as a horse's back. I know you might not have a horse handy to measure how high its back is off the ground, but if you pick a standard horse that they would have had, like a quarter horse, and you say, how high is the back of the horse? A horse's back is about 5 feet off the ground. Not the horse's head, not even its shoulder, but they said horse's back. That's about 5 feet off the ground. And these taller peas, they do indeed grow about 5 feet tall by the end of their growth at the end of the summer. They start off short, and then they get about 5 feet tall, and that's as tall as they get, and then they bloom, and then they die back down in the winter. So the high as a horse's back is a pretty good description, actually. Many of the flowers, oh, this is a list. So these are 13 different pea species just from that little tiny patch that we experimented with. Many different genera: Chamacrysta, Desmodium, Galactia, Lespediza, Senna, Stylosanthes. And here's a close-up. So these peas aren't all famous wildflowers, but they do have really neat flowers if you look at them closely. So with the help of a macro lens, you can have some fun photography with them. And they come in different colors. This one is one of my favorites. This is a Lespediza bretonii, which was originally named as a species back 100 years ago. Today, bretonii is believed to be a natural hybrid of 2 other species. That's the current interpretation of it. It does produce seeds, so it is thought to be a hybrid that does indeed produce fruits. And when you have so much pea diversity, the peas intermingle and you get new pea forms that look different from their parents, and you get a whole lot of diversity, even in a very small area. So for pea photographers, these dense mixed patches offer a lot of fun. Now, yeah, these are just a few other shots, kind of showing that this is from early in the summer, so it's not full grown yet. You can see things like there's lineatum down there in the front, there's Stylosanthes, there's the taller Desmodium glabellum starting to grow up. It gets bigger and bigger as the season goes on. Now, I do want to say that the pea-vine ecosystem is more than just peas, all right? I don't want to give you the idea that we were once a pea monoculture, or even just a pea family monoculture. They did say that there were flowers of every description growing in these prairies, wildflowers of every hue. So we've had other things pop up besides Peavine. It's not 100% Peavine, even though the peas dominate. And perhaps the most surprising thing that popped up was this little plant. It is a true lettuce. It's in the lettuce family. You can eat it. And it goes by the name of red wood lettuce. It has these reddish purple stems and little orangish flowers. And there was a time when, much like the peavine, this was a common widespread plant. 100 years ago, when people wrote books like Wildflowers Every Child Should Know, they had an entry on the red wood lettuce because it was a wildflower every child should know 100 years ago. It was found all over. You can see on this map all throughout eastern North America. These are all counties with specimens reported. If you could go back 200 years ago when the vast prairie covered much of the eastern United States in different ways, it probably was far more abundant than even those little dots suggest. So once upon a time, a widespread plant. But today, the redwood lettuce, it has declined in many places. It's considered state extirpated in Maryland, Connecticut, DC, state endangered in New York and Illinois, state threatened in Ohio, Indiana, Vermont, or watch listed in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, all these other places. Here in North Carolina, one specimen of redwood lettuce was collected in the last 50 years, at least that we know of. Prior to that, in the earlier 1900s, there were a lot more specimens, but in the last 50 years, collections became really, really scarce. We never saw this plant here until we did the burn in the pea patch. So it just popped up out of the soil following the burn, and we're happy to have it again because there are very, very few places where populations are known today to exist, known and confirmed to exist in North Carolina. I hope there are many more out there. I hope we're not the only one. I can't believe that we would be. That was everywhere once upon a time, but there are just not very many reports. So beautiful wildflowers, not just peas, all part of the pea prairie ecosystem. Neat thing about the wood lettuce, it loves fire. You burn it in the March, burn everything to black. This plant is one of the very first plants that puts out leaves following the burn. Sometimes in less than a week, it pushes out new leaves, way ahead of almost everything else. It seems to just love the fire. And then it'll send a stalk about 5 feet tall with its flowers in the middle of the summer. And then it'll die. Dies after flowering. So unless the sunny burning habitat is continued, then since it dies after flowering, it disappears. But we've had them flowering here every year for the last 4 years since we started the pea prairie experiment. So that's a little bit of talk about the history of the land and the old days of peas. So I just leave us with the Lorax. If you like any of these plants, or if you have other plants that you like, it's up to us. If we understand the way the plants grew in the past, then maybe we can make that work for us again. And something like a prairie could be possible again in the future. So this is where I know I'm running out of time, and I thought we might have some questions. So, hi, Chris.
Bryan, first off, great big round of applause for you because this was a fantastic presentation.
Oh,
I am enthralled by this story. And I do this every.
well, thank you. Thank you. It's fun to share. I love sharing it with people here. If you all were here in person, I'd walk you over and show you the little peas sprouting up in the spring. So how's it going out there in the chat?
So I'm going to give everybody in the chat just a moment to sort of download the presentation, formulate their thoughts, and then get their questions typed up. I'm a little curious about how you continue to manage your little prairie plot there, because I would guess that native plants aren't the only thing that keep trying to come back, even with annual burning.
Sure. So that's a great point. So I should say this land, Wilkerson Nature Preserve, it was a farm, a working farm up until 2005. So there was literally a herd of cows on this land until then. It had been a farm for probably 200 years before that. It had been a farm the whole time Dr. Annie lived here. It had been a farm for always. So those plants like the Lespedeza that had been encouraged in the past, the Syriacea Lespedeza, they definitely grow here in the park. And they popped up too. So peas have these hard seed coats and they can be stimulated to germinate by burning. And so we did see things like the exotic Lespedeza pop up. But I walked over there and I could tell what Lespedezas are what. And if it wasn't a native, I just pulled it up and threw it over the fence. So yeah, we didn't use chemicals. I tested chemicals once, but it seemed to kill everything. So if I see something non-native, I just pull it up and toss it over the fence. But the burning has really done a great help in really reducing most of the non-natives without us having to do much more.
Very interesting. Thanks. One of our viewers is curious, how tall was the fence that you built?
Great question. It's as high as a horse's back. It's 5 feet.
Okay. And that seems to work against your deer population?
Well, it's not deer proof. All right. We've never claimed that it's deer proof, but it doesn't need to be deer proof. Deer were here, in the 1700s, but the deer populations today are just so much higher. If you went back historically, there would have been large predators, there would have been bears, there would have been wolves. We don't have those large predators, and the deer are so abundant now. We don't need to eliminate deer completely from the habitat, but a 5-foot fence discourages the deer. It makes them less willing to enter the area, even though they're able to. So if they browse a little bit, that's fine. But things that are not fenced, a herd of 30 deer, I've seen this happen. A herd of 30 deer can just walk to a patch of our park and then just eat everything down to, little nubs, and that can happen in an evening. So the fence discourages the deer. It doesn't eliminate them completely. Hopefully it's simulating something like the historic deer density.
Nice. Seems to be working so far, I guess. Another good question. Chris Hill wants to know what differentiates pea vines from other peas, such as hog peanut.
Okay, so this is like I said, Peavine is a general term. It's a general term, not a single species. So hog peanut has been called Peavine, the same as many other species. So if I didn't put slides about this, but in the literature, Apios, Amphicarpa, Desmodium, Chama Christa, Lespedeza, Galactia, all these different pea genera have been called wild pea vines at different points in time. So is hog peanut among the wild pea vines? Absolutely 100% it is. And in some places, hog peanut, that's Amphicarpa to the Latin botanists out there, in some habitats, that may have been one of the dominant pea vines in certain habitats. It's not present in my 0.08 of an acre. We have other experimental plots here in the preserve that we're also burning where we do have hog peanut. So I focused on this one particular little experiment, but we have many others, including some that are stimulating the hog peanut. So that is another good pea as well.
That brings up a question for me is these places, if Wilkerson was a farm for over 200 years, and then parts of it were allowed to grow up to forest, and then you didn't have many, if any, of these plants in the landscape because they were covered over by non-natives or other bushes and shrubs and trees, where did these pea vines come from to repopulate your plot?
So this would be my hypothesis. Peas are well known for their thick seed coats and that the seeds can be dormant in the soil for extended periods of time. So it is entirely possible that clearing away the bushes, letting in sunlight, and then burning the smoke chemicals going down into the soil, the heat, stimulated germination in many seeds. Also, peas are they're not all extinct. You can find peas in the landscape. You'll find them probably in your backyard, but they don't make the pea-dominated community that is seemingly implied by all these Peavine references. So even small amounts of pea that were surviving, once the shrubbery is removed, fire is reintroduced, and the deer herds are fenced out, even a little bit of pea, given the chance, rapidly grew into this luxurious carpet. So a mix of dormant seeds in the seed bank and small stunted individuals that were just too small to hardly notice, then flourishing when the conditions changed.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, another question from the chat for you. Any efforts to try to revive peas beyond your spot?
Ooh, beyond my spot. So that is a good question. Um, there has been a wonderful interest in recent years, in recent decades, in more prescribed fire in the landscape broadly in North Carolina. Many agencies have gotten on board with that, and prescribed fire will certainly benefit peas when it is used in combination with those other factors. So while they often won't say, we're burning this forest for the sake of the peas, if you do those things, if you maintain historically normal deer populations and bring back prescribed fire, then peas will benefit from that. The biggest fans of peas are usually the quail lovers. Bobwhite quail used to be really, really abundant, and it has declined enormously. Some people say down 90% in the last 50 years. I've heard different things about that, but the quail has declined enormously. Everybody agrees on that. But the people who are really interested in maintaining quail will tell you that our wild peas are one of the greatest foods for them. In fact, there's one of the peas called partridge pea. That's the name of the pea. Quail love these things. So the people who maintain quails and restore habitat for them, they are some of the top ones to appreciate pea.
Oh, fascinating. Fascinating stuff. All right. We're just about out of time here. I'm curious for you, as a botanist, as a conservationist, as somebody managing a site like this, you're restoring the peas, and that gets us back to at least the early 1700s. And then, as Elijah Mitchell indicated, this Carolina savanna probably persisted for generations before Europeans settled North Carolina. But how do you decide to go back to, say, the 1750s when you're thinking about habitat restoration and getting back to, I don't know, what we think of as some sort of like wild state or an undisturbed natural environment? Or should we even consider that?
Um, sure. So why not go farther? Why not go to some point before then? That's the question.
More or less, yeah, yeah.
Well, well, we know that those land managers that were here to the 1700s, the indigenous peoples, that they had been here for a very long time. The archaeologists will tell you that North Carolina has been inhabited since the Ice Age. We have 10,000-year-old artifacts. So if you're trying to go back to an ecology with no humans whatsoever, then you're looking something before the Ice Age, when the climate was completely different, when the fauna was completely different and had, mammoths and all sorts of animals that we don't have at all. But when the Ice Age ended and the climate starts changing to what we have now, there were people here that entire time, people throughout that entire process of developing towards our modern climate. Those people had fire that entire time. They weren't fire non-using peoples. So even if you pushed it back 1500s, 1,000 years ago, there's no obvious reason why it would have been that different from what it was up to the 1700s. But the 1700s when things changed dramatically, because you've got cows being introduced and pigs and all these species that were not here prior to that.
Right, yeah. I love that. That's fascinating. It makes me curious about what other sources of knowledge that there exist about these landscapes before Europeans started writing their treatises on them, that that can inform conservation decisions and how we manage landscapes today so much.
I look forward to future talks with experts who could enlighten us all on that.
Well, I appreciate your expertise in enlightening us on these historic landscapes in North Carolina and the efforts to bring back even just a small piece of it. It's pretty cool and enlightening stuff.
Thank you, Chris.
I really appreciate it. What a fun talk. Everybody keep a lookout because I think I'm going to go burn my backyard now and see if I can get some peas to come up with experts. We'll see. Everybody, thanks for tuning into this edition of the Lunchtime Discovery series. I hope we'll see you again here next Wednesday at noon for another program. Don't miss out. Head to eenorthcarolina.org to see the schedule of events. You can also check out naturalsciences.org. Both places have the programs for this series. You can also sign up for social media alerts, and you can sign up for email newsletters. We've got every way imaginable for you to stay connected with what's happening over here at your state institutions. And I'm pretty sure you can jump on the internet and find out what's going on in Wilkerson Preserve Park, and maybe take a visit and go check out the pea patch one day. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you again soon. Bye, folks.